Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Real Grit by Silas K. Hocking, which I have with me here. When last we were together and reading Real Grit, we were catching up with Jack Formby, who had been missing for some time. What he had been doing, or even whether he was still alive, was a source of considerable debate between his friends and loved ones. But we have discovered that Jack has been having rather a hard go of it. He was homeless for a time on the streets before being brought in by the constabulary on charges of vagrancy. He managed to persuade the jury to release him from that charge and found work as a stable hand and later the conductor of an omnibus, which was good work, though it did not seem to suit him with the long hours and arduous labour. He did not find as much satisfaction in it as he did in working with the horses. And so the man who he had replaced as conductor has returned to his post, and Jack has decided to seek his fortune elsewhere. He has heard, I believe, of the upcoming nuptials of his old friend, and has decided to return to Bodelford and its surrounding area, where we know that he will meet up with Miss Ada Woodville as a face in the crowd. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't quite gotten back to that point in the story yet. And so let us find our way there, through the text, as we read on in Real Grit, with Chapter 24, Familiar Scenes. I can reach Esserbrig in an hour before dark, was Jack's thought on alighting at Bodelford, and nothing can be gained by my wasting my time here. I want to see no one in Bodelford, and no one wants to see me. And shouldering his bundle, and pulling the peak of his cap over his eyes, he marched away. It seemed a little strange to be walking through the streets that had been familiar to him since childhood, in working man's attire. Not more than 12 months ago, he had driven with his father through the same streets behind a splendid pair of bays, and had been the envy of many a busy man of business and overworked clerk. Now he was as poor as the poorest artisan that trudged wearily to his toil, and far less happy than most of them. Every now and then a familiar face loomed into sight and passed close to his side, but there was no glance of recognition in any eye. Even Mr. Toadsby passed him without bestowing a second glance. I must have greatly changed, he said sadly to himself, or else these clothes are a complete disguise. Well, it's best it should be so. It would be very awkward to be recognized, and not a little humiliating. For so far I have failed, and failed very conspicuously. He was not sorry when he had left the city behind and found himself in the comparative quiet and seclusion of the Bodle Valley. There was a good footpath along the bank of the river for several miles, and though the high road to Essebrigg was more direct, the footpath was much the pleasanter route, and for that reason he adopted it. His progress was by no means rapid, for as yet he was only weak, and he began to feel tired much sooner than he had expected. He resolutely tramped on, however, buoyed up with the hope that he would catch a glimpse of Ada Woodville's face before he slept. About noon he rested for half an hour by the wayside, and ate a hearty meal of bread and cheese that he had provided himself with before he started, then proceeded on the tramp again. After a while, the scene began to grow more and more familiar, and he forgot his weariness as old memories began to crowd in upon his brain. A turn in the valley at length revealed the fringe of Essebrigg moors, and for a moment he paused, thinking he saw a moving figure far up the hillside, and jumping at once to the conclusion that it must be Ada Woodville. Fancy, however, had cheated him this time, and with a sigh he tramped on again. Now another turn in the road, and Rycroft stands revealed, more beautiful in his eyes than ever. He could hardly keep back the tears as he stopped to have a good look at it, nestling so grandly among the trees. How true it is, he muttered to himself, that we never properly value things until we lose them. How little I valued my mercies when I had scarcely a wish ungratified, and how discontented I was in the midst of plenty. Perhaps God is punishing me now for my base ingratitude, and if it be so, I must try to bear my punishment like a man, and not whine like a whipped schoolboy. A moment later, and the bells of Essebrigg Church clashed out a merry peal that floated triumphantly down the valley, and seemed to fill all the air with shouts of gladness. "I wonder what's up," he said to himself, as he dropped his bundle and leaned over a stile to listen to the wild, jubilant music. "But here comes a schoolboy. He'll know, very likely." And Jack waited, patiently, till the lad came up. "What are the bells ringing for, my lad? Do you know?" Jack questioned as the lad drew near.
"Oh, aye,"
was the answer.
"The young squires are coming home today."
"The young squire?" said Jack in a questioning tone.
"Aye, young Squire Netherby. He's been and got wed, don't you know?"
the boy answered, with wide-open eyes. "No, I didn't know," Jack answered.
"Oh, you're a stranger, you are,"
said the boy, evidently pleased at the opportunity of showing off his acquaintance with local affairs.
"Well, then I'd better tell you that Master Dick is the only son of the old squire as lives at the Hall. He's got wed to a very rich lady in London or somewheres. That were a month ago or so. Howsomever, they are a-coming home to-day, and there's to be a fine jollification to-night at Rycroft."
"At Rycroft?" said Jack in some little surprise, which, however, was more feigned than real, as now that he had the opportunity, he was anxious to get hold of all news possible.
"Aye,
said the boy with glee.
They're going to have fireworks and balloons and whittles as much as folks can stuff.
But how is it, asked Jack, that all these grand doings are not to be at the hall?
Oh, the young squire's left the hall now. He's bought Rycroft and is a-going to live there for good.
Indeed, said Jack.
Aye, and Rycroft is a mighty grand place too. Mr. Formby and his son used to live there. He were a terrible rich man, so I've heard. But he lost all his brass of a sudden, and then he took ill and died, and his son was left without nothing to live on, so he drowned himself in the river down at Bodelford.
Drowned himself, eh?
Aye, I thought everybody knowed that. He got into trouble, though nobody believed he were to blame, and as he had nothing to do, and no friends, he took it very much to heart, and so put an end to himself.
That was very sad.
Folks say as he would have made a man of himself if he had lived, for he took to work real well, and without no grumbling, though he were nowt but a loafing idle kind of chap when he were at home. But he started real well when the screw was put on. He were always a kind, good-natured feller, but without no go till he were driven into a corner. Then he turned real plucky. Howsomever, he were accused of something that nobody believes was true, and that were too much for him. He just kicked the bucket right off, and that were the end of him.
Well, nobody missed him very much, I expect, Jack said reflectively.
Very likely not, said the boy after a pause. Though they do say as how Miss Woodville, the squire's niece, fretted a good deal, and were terrible cut up for a while. But she's got over it now, I reckon, for folks say how she's a-going to marry Mr. Ralph Formby, who is a relation of the Mr. Formby as drowned himself.
Do people say that? Jack asked quickly.
Oh, aye, everybody's expecting another wedding around in a bit, and Mr. Ralph is a wonderful good to the poor, so folks say. Though he ain't a rich man, he gives a lot away, and keeps himself poor, he's that good-natured. But Miss Woodville, you should see her. She's a beauty.
And the boy rolled up his eyes, as much to say that words altogether failed him. I should like to see her very much, Jack said, anxious to continue the conversation.
Then go to the jollification tonight, said the boy quickly. Everyone's going, for the grounds is to be thrown open to the public, and Miss Woodville is sartin to be there.
I think I will drop in if I can afford the time, Jack said.
I would if I were you,
returned the boy.
But I must be off home and leave my slate, for I wouldn't miss the fun for anything.
And without any more words, he started off at a run, and was soon out of sight. Said Jack, as soon as he found himself alone. So Jack Formby is dead, is he? Committed suicide. And the girl he loved is going to marry his cousin. A nice state of affairs, certainly. It would be funny if I were to make myself known and upset all of their little plans. And he pulled off his cap and ran his fingers through his hair as though better to debate the question. No, he went on, I have no right to interfere or speak to her until I have redeemed my character from reproach and made a position in the world. Still, I will not hide myself. And when she sees me tonight, she will know that the story about my having drowned myself is a fabrication. And if she ever loved me, she will wait a few years at least. Yet I have no hope that I shall ever be in a position to win her, and it's foolish of me to even think of her at all. As soon as it was dusk, he entered the grounds of Rycroft, and hid himself in the crowd. He saw Dick Netherby and his wife, and almost envied him his happiness. He saw the old squire, looking as hale as ever, with Mrs. Netherby leaning on his arm. He saw Kate, still proud and stately, and by her side he saw Ada, looking as sweet as an angel from heaven. His heart gave a great bound when she first appeared upon the scene, and his first impulse was to rush out and greet her. But the feeling was only momentary. A sense of shame seemed to suddenly come over him, and he shrank back among the crowd to be out of sight as much as possible. All unconscious of his presence, she went in and out amongst Dick's humble guests, scattering smiles and kind words on every hand. And as Jack gazed after her with wistful, hungry eyes, he felt more keenly than ever the greatness of his loss. Never had she seemed so beautiful in his eyes. Never had her goodness been more conspicuous. I was never worthy of her, he reflected. She was never meant for such as me. I can only worship her at a distance. And perhaps the less I see of her, the better for my peace. He was quite unable to tear himself away from the place, however, while she was in sight. Like a dark shadow he dogged her steps and eagerly treasured up every smile she gave, though none of them were for him. Sometimes he almost felt angry with her that she looked so happy. If she believes me dead, she has soon forgotten me, he said to himself. But that is the way of the world. So I ought not to complain. And if she's going to marry Ralph, she ought to look happy. And he clenched his fists savagely and turned to leave the place. But the fascination of her presence held him fast, and he could not feel angry for more than a moment, however much she tried. She has a right to marry Ralph if she loves him, he reflected, and if she does not love him, nothing I know will induce her to marry him. Anyhow, it is only right that I should let her know that I am living. And he followed the crowd to see the last display of fireworks. Now is my opportunity, he said to himself, so I will get to the front. Ah, there's Ralph, looking sleek and triumphant, and she is by his side. If they have any eyes at all, they are bound to see me. Ah, she looks this way. Now be cool, Jack Formby, and don't make a fool of yourself. How intently she scans every face. Is she searching for someone, I wonder? Now our eyes meet. Does she recognize me? Yes. She starts and turns pale. Now she clutches his arm. Is she afraid that I'm coming to her? See, she nestles closer to him, but for me she has no smile, and scarcely a look of recognition. Evidently I'm not wanted. Farewell, then. And he lifted his cap, and stood for a moment with head uncovered, then quietly slunk away through the crowd, and in a few moments had passed through the lodge gates, and was on the tramp again. It had been his intention to spend the night in Esserbrig, but he altered his plan and tramped on to the next village 4 miles away. He had seen the face he loved, but he had derived no satisfaction. Ada Woodville seemed more completely lost to him than she ever had. He had told himself for months past that it was foolish to hope, and yet he kept hoping, notwithstanding. "Now," he said, "I shall hope no more. The dream is over, and I am awake at last. For the future, duty shall be my bride, and heaven shall be my hope and my reward." Chapter 25. A New Departure. Jack discovered that the new railway was further away from Esserbrig than he had thought, but the remaining distance could easily be covered in a day. Indeed, from Thurston, where he spent the night, he believed he would be able to reach the scene of operations by sundown, and for that purpose he started as soon as it was dawn. About noon he reached the village of Dovely, and sat down to rest near a large mill that was in course of erection. "On the lookout for a job, mate?" asked a working man, passing close to where he sat. "Aye. Anything to be got hereabouts?" "Likely as not. One of our fellows fell off a ladder this morning and broke his leg." "Was he a bricklayer?" "No, only a tenter." "I could manage that," Jack said. "Is the gaffer anywhere about?" "Aye, he's yonder, with a billock hat." "Thanks, I'll go to him." And, suiting the action to the word, he marched straight up to the foreman and asked, in a simple phraseology of working men, if he could give him a job. "Are you new in these parts?" was the question that greeted him. "I am," said Jack. "I was going on to Fernbeck Dale to see if I could get a job at the new railway works, but hearing that one of your hands has met with an accident, I thought I would ask to be taken in on his place." "You used to this kind of work?" "No, I'm not, but I presume I soon should get used to it." "If I were to take you for a week on approval, would that suit you?" "Yes, quite well." "Agreed, then. You can start at once if you like." To say that Jack took kindly to the hod would scarcely be true. Still, 24 shillings per week was not to be sneezed at, as one of his mates said, and as he had to work or starve, he was glad to take the first position that offered itself. For the first few days he felt as though every part of his body had been bruised by heavy blows, but he soon got over it, and when once in the full swing of his work, he found it quite easy, and in some respects pleasant. He remained at Dovely 3 months, by which time the mill was completed, and when he left, he was healthier and heavier than he had ever been before in his life. Besides which, he had several pounds in his pocket, and very good hopes of increasing his store. At Fernbeck Dale he had no difficulty in getting work. One glance at his face showed that he was no besotted navvy, but a working man of the highest type, clean, well-knit, and intelligent. He discovered that the chief contractor had sublet the work to a number of other smaller men, each one of whom was anxious to make as much as possible out of his contract, and, for this purpose, kept his eye well on his hands. Eager to waste no time, Jack applied to the first of these subcontractors that appeared on the scene, and was taken on at once. He regretted, afterwards, that he had been so precipitate, for he found himself in a cutting, with a gang of men of the real navvy type, low-browed, heavy-jawed, besotted men, who could not speak 10 words without an oath, and whose highest conception of happiness was to have unlimited opportunities of fuddling, and who spoke of being drunk as the acme of all delight. Jack held little converse with them, however. His business was to do his work to the satisfaction of his employers, and to this he bent all his energies. His comrades soon discovered that he was not one of their class, and began to persecute him in consequence. Not in very violent fashion, it's true, but they hurled coarse sneers at him at every opportunity, nicknamed him the Duke, taunted him with being pious, and said he was too stingy to afford himself a glass of beer or a pipe. All this Jack bore in very good humour, for he saw that in case of a quarrel he would get the worst of it. The gang held together in everything, and regarded him as an interloper, if not a spy, and determined, before Jack had been with them a week, that they would have their revenge when pay night came. Most of the men lived in wooden huts that had been provided by the contractors, for the district was very sparsely populated. A few farmhouses and workmen's cottages were scattered here and there on the hillsides, but the nearest village was 3 miles away. Jack had no liking for the wooden huts, or for the company found in them, so he secured cheap lodgings in a cottage about 1 mile away, and enjoyed the quiet walk to and fro, morning and evening. This was another source of grievance for the mates, who taunted him with his upstart ways and wanted to know whether he considered he was better than they were. "I've never considered the matter at all," Jack said, "but surely in a matter of this sort I am at liberty to do as I like." "Don't know about that," was the surly answer. "A man should live among his mates, and be like the rest of 'em." "But there are others besides me who lodge away from their work. Aye, gangers and gaffers and that rock," was the reply. "But you're not a ganger." "No, but I'm a man," Jack said with spirit, "and I claim the rights of a man." "You do, eh?" "Yes, I do." "Then let me tell you, you're a bit too big for your jacket, and you'll be let down a peg before you're much older." "I've done no wrong to anyone," Jack replied, "and while I treat others civilly, I shall expect to be treated so myself." "Oh, aye, you're too mighty civil by half. If you were a bit more of a devil, nobody'd complain." "I'm quite devil enough for my own comfort," Jack replied with a laugh, "but not for ours," the man said with a growl. "That remains to be proved," Jack said with a smile, and walked away. Pay night came once a fortnight, and on leaving the office after he had received his first wages, Jack was met by several of his mates, who informed him that, according to the usual custom, he would have to pay his footing. "Pay my footing?" said Jack in surprise. "What's that?" Every new hand has to pay his footing on his first draw, was the answer. And what is the footing? Jack asked. 1 gallon of gin, they replied. A gallon of moonshine, said Jack with a laugh. But we all go shares, every man in the camp, they said. Well, let me tell you that I shall purchase no gallon of gin, said Jack. You will not? No. I object on principle to any such demand, and I particularly object to bringing strong drink into this camp if it can be kept out. I don't drink myself, and it would be better for everyone if you drank less. That's our business, they said. But you want me to make it my business, Jack answered. We expect you to pay your footing, they replied. And if I object to do so? Do you know what the penalty is? No, and I don't much care. You know Nick Whiffle? Yes. What of it? Nothing, except you'll have to fight him. I shall fight no one, Jack replied. We'll see about that, was the answer, and in a moment Jack found himself knocked off his legs, and in a moment more 4 men had got hold of him, 1 at each arm and leg, and were bearing him swiftly towards the camp. A crowd had already assembled in anticipation of the sport, for it was quite expected that Jack would object to pay his footing, and Nick Whiffle, the bully of the camp, was in readiness for the encounter. The great fear was that when it came to the pinch, as they expressed it, Jack would back out. For as much as they loved the drink, they would far rather see a good stand-up fight. In several encounters that had already taken place, Nick Whiffle had won an easy victory, and was unanimously voted, in consequence, the champion bruiser. Whiffle was an overgrown and somewhat loosely built fellow, standing 6 feet 1 inch in his stockings. Like most big men, he was an easy-tempered individual, by no means quarrelsome in his nature, unless in drink or excited by a crowd. But when thoroughly roused, he was described as a very devil. A stand-up fight he regarded as rare fun, and was always pleased to punish any greenhorn or newcomer that refused to conform to the usages of the camp. He'd heard of the Duke several times, but had not yet seen him. Hence, when Jack suddenly confronted him, he started back, expecting to find a very different kind of man. He saw in a moment that this handsome and supple youth was no navvy-born. There was something in his clear-cut features, in the steady light of his kindly eye, that stamped him as belonging to a different set. "So, you want to fight, Mr. Duke, do you?" he said, glaring uneasily at Jack. "No, I do not," was the reply. "I rather wish to live at peace with everyone in the camp, but I do not choose to be trampled on." "You'd better pay your footin'," said Whiffle. "It'd be a pity to spoil up your purty mug, as I'd be sartin to do in the first round." "I must take my chance of that," Jack answered, a little bit defiantly, for the manner in which he had been waylaid and hustled back to the camp had put him upon his mettle, and he felt in a more thoroughly fighting humour than he had done for many a year. Moreover, he did not feel at all frightened at Whittle. A giant in stature he might be, and for aught he knew a giant in strength, but he was neither quick nor supple, and Jack felt that science was a match for strength any day, and that what he lacked in size he might make up for in skill. "Very good," said the giant, slowly. "If you're determined to fight, come on." And with that, the crowd drew back in a circle. A rope was stretched between two stakes in less time than it takes to describe it. "Look here, mates," said Jack, making a last appeal. "I consider this treatment anything but honourable. I have no grudge against Whiffle, or he against me, that I'm aware of."
"Ah, he's beginning to show the white feather,"
cried one or two or three in the crowd, in mocking tones. "No, mates," he said, "I do not think I am a coward, but I do pride myself on being an Englishman, and I love fair play. I object on principle to give my money to make this camp more drunken than it is at present. You know as well as I do that drink is your curse, and you know very well that you can do without it. I'm not a pledged abstainer, but when I found that I could not afford drink, I gave it up, and when I made the further discovery that I was better without than with it, I resolved to continue to do without it. If any of you were sick or in need, I would gladly share with you my last crust, but no man, and no number of men, shall bully me into doing what is against my conscience."
"Well done, Duke," several shouted. "That's plucky."
"But I tell you plainly," he went on, "I do not want to fight. And I shall strike no man first, but if any man strikes me, I shall defend myself."
"That's it," they shouted. "Pat him on the nose, Whiffle, and draw the claret, and then we'll see what the cove is made of."
But Jack kept too far away from the rope for Whiffle to touch him, seeing which several men suddenly pushed him forward, and Whiffle made a lurch with his long arm. But Jack was ready for the attack, and parried his blow quite easily. A second thrust, and a third, succeeded no better, while his mates chaffed him on the shortness of his arm, and slyly hinted that at last he had met his match. This only angered Whiffle, who began to strike out right and left in the most reckless fashion. Jack's game was an altogether defensive one, and in this he succeeded admirably. Try as he would, Whiffle could not touch him, and getting thoroughly angry at length, he dealt Jack a blow under the belt. This was too much for our hero. His blood rose to boiling point in a moment, and ere Whiffle was aware, Jack had dealt him a tremendous blow between the eyes. For a second he was thoroughly staggered, but on recovering himself, he made a rush for his opponent and tried to collar him. But shouts of "Fair play!" checked him in this move, and he began again to deal out his blows in all directions. Jack's defensive game now proved of great advantage to him. He had conserved his strength, while Whiffle had exhausted his. And so, while he was able to parry Whiffle's blows without difficulty, his superior skill and training enabled him to plant, at the same time, a regular succession of stinging blows straight in his opponent's face. Whiffle continued to strike out as long as he could see, and tried to take every mean advantage possible. But skill and science were more than a match for his ungainly strength, and he walked away, at length, between two of his comrades, thoroughly cowed and beaten. Meanwhile, Jack had become thoroughly reckless and defiant, and wanted to know if there was any other man in the camp that wished to bully him. "If so," he said, "I am just in the humour for the fray, and if not, let me live amongst you henceforth in peace." No man forthcoming, however, and from that day the Duke was voted the champion, and was allowed to go his own way unmolested. So there we have it, the other half of the story of the party, and the continuing saga of Jack Formby's search for self-improvement. I didn't foresee that he would be a good boxer, but that does seem like one of the things that young gentlemen are schooled in, and I rather like the use of the term science there. It's not what we think of as science today, but I'm guessing it refers to the training and strict methodology that comes with learning to fight properly. And so science beat brute strength, as it is often wont to do. An interesting chapter, and interesting to speculate as to what will come next in the story of Jack Formby, now that he has proven himself and his mettle to his mates. We will see how they react and respond next time on Soft Stories. Thank you all so much for joining me. I appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you. And until next time, I will say only that I wish you all the best, and goodbye.